Today on Midlife Conversations, I've got an episode that I was not planning on releasing right now, but I am releasing it early. This is a special edition interview that's for my upcoming live deep dive summit that will be airing at the end of May. However, this interview was so good that I couldn't wait to share it because I think there's a lot of us that need to know about this. We're talking about mold toxicity, what we might not be aware of is happening in our homes, how it could be affecting our health. I didn't want to wait to air it. So I'm introducing it on my podcast right now as a sample of some of the great interviews I have coming for this summit end of May. I think you're going to really love learning from Jason, who founded Got Mold. I believe at the end of this interview, you are probably going to be convinced, like I do, that we need to test our homes. All of us need to test our homes. So if that is you and you decide, I need to test my home, I want you to go to gotmold.com/Natalie Jill. There'll be a free guide there. You can also use coupon Natalie Jill to save on your home testing kit. I myself, right after this interview, went and ordered a 3-room testing kit, and I'm eager to find out what's going on in my home. It could explain a lot of things with health. I think you're going to love this episode.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that intro.
So let's back up for a minute. You grew up, and I remember you told me sort of off interview, but I want to bring this up again, how you were, as a child, you had all these issues. You were sick and no one knew that this was the cause. What was going on then?
Yes. Well, first of all, I think that's very common. It's much more common than I think people think. My situation was many decades ago, where mold awareness was non-existent. I mean, it was mold, wipe it off. There was just no awareness at the time. But I suddenly fell ill when I was about 4 years old, lost a lot of body weight in a 3-week period, was having difficulty breathing. My parents took me to the pediatrician, who said, you should take him to Children's Hospital, which has a renowned respiratory clinic, and was just about an hour away from our house. And so that's where we went. And the initial diagnosis, based upon my symptoms and my family history, was cystic fibrosis. And so that was, needless to say, a devastating diagnosis, in particular from my parents, because it was a major concern of theirs. My father had lost 4 of his cousins to CF before the age of 14. So this was their worst nightmare coming true. And I was their only child. So they cried for 6 weeks while they waited for the second opinion, which fortunately, and evidenced by the fact that I sit here at 46 years old, I did not have CF. I don't have CF. Actually, what I had was asthma compounded by pneumonia. And when they tested me for allergies, which was one of my formative memories, it's one of the first things I remember. I can still smell the room even. They put a papoose on you, or like a straight jacket for toddlers, you know, with an open back, and then the drug ridden, and then they put the antigens in, and wait for a reaction. And my dad described, he says, I looked like a ladybug. My back just was red and swollen with dots all over it. And so I tested positive for every single thing that they checked me for. So the short list was grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans. And I grew up on a little non-working farm surrounded by all those things, you know. So we were dogs, cats, cotton, soybean. I had soybean fields to the right, cornfields across the street, and I was allergic to all that stuff. And so I essentially lived on inhalers, and intuitively, I spent a lot of time outside. I did not spend as much, even though the basement was where all the fun stuff was. I always felt heavy down there, and the weight. And so it was not. I intuitively spent more time outside, even though theoretically I had a lot more allergen exposure. But that musty smell always weighed on me. In any case, I lived like that until I was about 12. And then my parents split up and I moved out of that house, and all my symptoms went away.
Wow.
It wasn't immediate, but it was fast enough that my family had chalked it up to spontaneous adolescent remission is the term.
Okay.
In other words, they have no idea.
And did you put that together at all initially when you moved, that it was the house? No.
Okay. Nobody did.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't even a thought. And then fast forward a little bit. So I moved out, and then about a year later, my mom passed away, actually to suicide. And so that's actually a relevant part of the story, because, and we'll get back to that. And then I got Lyme disease, or I was diagnosed with Lyme disease about a year later. And so major antibiotics, both from the pneumonia and also from Lyme disease. And then I had a series of happy accidents, if you will, or fortunate disasters that led me to Wall Street when I was 16. got recruited out of a gas station. It's a fairy tale kind of a story. And I did that for 9 years and had a great career. And then at the end, after the dot-com bubble burst, I decided to do something meaningful with my life. And my mom's voice actually echoed, which she always imparted upon me, the importance of service to the greater good, it's contribution to the greater good. She used to have me volunteer at the hospital where she was the director of nursing during the summertime, mostly to keep me from burning the house down, but I think also to impart these kinds of values. And so, as a stockbroker, there weren't many people benefiting from my success except for the people who owned the stores where I shopped. Right. So there was a gap there for me. So I went backpacking. When I was away, I ended up in Hawaii for a spell. And I was reading a story in the local newspaper about a guy who'd gotten sick from the building where he was an employee. It was a major hotel, Hilton Hotel on Oahu, Waikiki Beach. And he developed adult onset asthma and all these allergies that he had never had before. And it was like a deja vu moment. It was immediate for me. I just immediately thought, geez, I wonder if the house that we were living in caused my mold, my respiratory illness. So I called my dad from a payphone, which probably isn't there anymore, and said, "Hey, do you think we had mold at Old Trenton Road?" And he just laughed at me. He goes, "Of course, we had mushrooms in the basement. Why do you ask?" And I said, "Well, do you think it was what made me sick?" And he goes, "Well, it couldn't have helped." If you know my dad, you know that's right. That's his humor, but it was also very true. And at the time, there was nothing to do about it because, again, I'm 46, right? This is only a recent phenomenon of awareness. And so in that moment, some people have a kind of a white light moment or an epiphany kind of a thing. And that was mine, where I immediately became fascinated with not mold per se, even though it's fascinating. And the more you look at it, the more fascinating it is, but rather the impact that the buildings we live and work in have on our health. Wow. This is fascinating to me. And it's never left me. It's been 20 years.
Now, so many people will say, okay, I know that musty smell and my house doesn't have that musty smell, or the building I work in doesn't have it. Is that a gauge of how to know if we have mold in a home, or is that just when it's gotten so extreme?
It's a really good question. So a musty smell is a dead giveaway of active mold growth. Now you can have dormant mold that does not emit the gases. So the musty smell is the digestive byproduct. Just like we produce gas when we digest, mold produces gas, but it occurs outside of it because the organism digests externally. And so those are the metabolic byproducts, mold burps, if you will. So naturally, if we're not eating, we're not producing gas. At least most of us aren't. And so same thing with mold. So if it's not producing gas, not producing the smell, that doesn't mean you don't have it. It just means it's not currently growing.
Sure.
But if you smell it, boy, that's a dead giveaway. And so that's an extremely important thing to track down. And the thing you want to track down is the source of the moisture, of course, right?
Yes.
If you smell that smell, it's not just an aesthetic nuisance. The recent studies around fruit flies, because you can't study people with these things, not ethically at least, but they've done really fascinating studies with fruit flies and exposed them to the musty smell, and they stop producing dopamine.
Wow.
They start flying down instead of to the light. They stop reproducing. They develop locomotive dysfunction. Parkinsonian-like symptoms is the way the researchers describe it, as well as mitochondrial damage. So the musty smell is neurotoxic. It's not just an aesthetic nuisance. So it's not just important as a signal, because it is a signal that you got a problem. You got to track down the moisture problem and find the extent of the issue, but it's also a source of illness.
When people have water damage in the house, or because that's common too. I know here, as I'm recording this in San Diego, we've had a lot of rain and we get a leak in our ceiling, whatever. There's a belief, my husband's included, one that will say that is like, oh, well, it's wood. It just dries out. Is that true?
Yes and no. So the wood is fine. Most wood. However, I just had a fascinating call with a woman in South Africa, a doctor, and she was describing the way her building is built. Old growth timber, plaster, brick. She's got moisture intrusion, doesn't really create that big of a mold problem. We build buildings in modern America out of paper mache, and we build out of green or white pine. Like, in other words, very young white pine. And so it's loaded with sugars, loaded with nutrients, right? And so mold doesn't really like wood. It's too hard to eat, but it loves the sugars, and given enough moisture, eventually it will grow on the wood. But what it really likes is it loves sheetrock, drywall, gypsum wallboard, The paper on it is the ideal mold food. It's literally the perfect mold food. It's like a petri dish. The gypsum holds the moisture like a sponge, and there's paper on both sides. So mold grows very, very nicely, usually on the dark side, because of course there's less disturbance and it dries slower. So when you get water intrusion into a cavity, there's two things that you got to worry about. Number one is the sheetrock, because it obviously can support fungal growth very, very easily. And by the way, I should mention, this is a really good spot to drop this in. Mold grows in as little as 24 to 48 hours after a water intrusion that's not dealt with properly. That's a big deal. The guidance from the EPA says 24 to 48 hours. The industry standard, which is called the IICRC S520, very important if anybody ever has to go through this process, and I'm sure many of the people who are listening will, that's the standard. That is the only consensus accepted industry standard. It's called the S520. They talk about, in fact, the S500 is the water damage standard. Both of them talk about 72 hours as the mark, right? So something gets wet and stays wet if it's porous and absorptive. So that sheetrock, carpet padding, upholstered furniture, things like that. Any of that stuff that will support fungal growth, 72 hours, and you got to treat it like mold, whether it's visible or not. So it's very important that you react to those things, and respond to them rather in a proactive way. And so that means removing wet materials before they get moldy. So usually, and I just had a leak like this in my kitchen from an ice dam. You got to cut out the sheetrock while it's wet, believe it or not. And the reason you do that is because you want to get rid of the sheetrock that's damaged so it doesn't get moldy, but also you want to get the insulation that's in there that's wet, because once insulation gets wet, it never dries. When I say never, I mean like until the dinosaurs come back, it won't dry. So it's in that cavity, and instead of acting like insulation, it's actually a thermal bridge. It actually will transfer heat from outside into your house, or cold from outside, depending upon what climate you're in. So it's very important to get that cavity open and dry. You also want to make sure there's no pre-existing mold there. So if there's already been a leak there and you're taking that, you don't be a cowboy. Right.
How do people do that though? So for instance, like you have a wood leak or your roof is leaking or whatever, and your wall looks good, your wall looks clean. Do you have to go bust through your wall to figure this out, or what do you do?
Unfortunately, the right way to do it is to do investigative demolition, and that should be done by a water damage specialist, someone who will put a tent around the work area to control the dust, and so that any of the dust they produce within that stays in the workspace. Right? Because mold-laden dust is what makes people sick.
Wow.
Mold-laden dust is, first of all, the dust itself, gypsum wallboard, gypsum dust, construction dust is very, very fine. If you've ever done any sort of sheetrock work in your house, you'll know that dust gets everywhere. Well, guess what? The mold spores travel along very nicely with that stuff. And so the combination of the construction debris and the fungi is enough to knock anybody down. So fungi-laden dust is something that needs to be managed very, very carefully. And so I suggest that people not do this kind of work on their own. I hate to say it, but most mold work, once you get past that 24 to 48 hours, you crest into professional services. So here further guidance on the 24 to 48 hours. This is really important. Water damage is free or cheap to fix. Water damage, when it's really your first leak. So if you had a bunch of leaks there, you can't look at this as the 24 to 40. If you've had leaks there, you probably already have you probably already have mold. But if it's a virgin leak, first time this has happened, if you address that quickly, it's either free or cheap. So in other words, free would be you do it yourself. You rip out the wet stuff and you let that cavity dry and you check that cavity. By the way, it's a really good idea to get a moisture meter. Every home should have a moisture meter, ideally with pin type. And you can check sheetrock, you can check wood. Very, very important tool for most homes, and most homes don't have one. Then, so if you rip it out yourself, then you've saved yourself a lot of, but in some cases it's too big, right?
Right.
A lot. So then you call your insurance company, or you call a water damage if you don't want to pull the homeowner's insurance ripcord, because that can cause a lot of other ramifications. But you want to get a water damage specialist in there that will take out that wet stuff and dry those areas.
Okay.
You do that.
So when
your insurance will cover that.
So Jason, if I'm hearing you correctly, like if you have a water leak in your roof or in the wood or whatever you're saying you can't just go deal with that. Like you got to check the drywall around that, because it could all be growing in there. And I think most people are skipping that. I know for sure have skipped that.
For sure. And it's very easy to skip it because you think, it's not so bad. It's a little area, it's not that big of a deal. But first of all, actually, let me back up. The first thing you gotta do is fix that roof leak.
Yep.
At the end of the day, mold is not the problem. Mold is a symptom of the problem. The enemy of a healthy building and the enemy of healthy occupants is moisture. It's very simple, right? It's very simple. And as soon as you have that imbalance that occurs, mold grows very quickly. So mold is just the symptom. Mold is like an alarm, if you will. Mold is the alert that when you smell that musty smell, look at it as an alert. You're being told there's an imbalance in the building. Now go find it, right? People think mold is so evil, but actually if mold wanted to kill you, you'd be dead. Fungi is much smarter than we are, but it also sends you a signal. It lets you know, hey, there's an imbalance here in the building. So let's go figure that out. And if you leave that be, it will grow from an aesthetic nuisance into cancer for the building, really, if you think about it. Right? The building materials start to rot. It's a lot like cancer for the body. Look at the building has a lot of systems in it that look a lot like a body, right? It's got a HVAC system, which is like respiratory. You've got the electrical system, which is like the nervous system. You've got the siding, is a lot like dermis or skin. The insulation of the walls, a lot like fat. You know, where's the immune system? Oh, we're the immune system in a building. You know, and so when a building gets sick, we get sick. When the building heals, we heal. There's a real relationship here. I don't look at buildings the way most people do, which is just these boxes that we live and work in. I look at buildings as an extension of our immune system. It's an exoskin or an exoskeleton, and the health of that exoskin and the health of that exoskeleton is your health. If that building is unhealthy because there's an imbalance, because there's a microbial imbalance, a moisture problem, the occupants will suffer. And when that building is corrected, the occupants will also reach equilibrium. There's a mutualism. There's a symbiosis.
It makes sense how you explain it. So it's just like when you heal your body, like you have to treat your environment as a whole, because you could do all the things to your body, but if you're in an environment that's toxic or creating this, you're going to have bigger issues.
That's right. It's true root cause stuff.
Okay. So how does, and I don't want to get too off track from testing and what we need to look for in our home, because that's important too, but what are some symptoms that people should be aware of? Because like, I know some people will say, oh, well, I don't have allergies. So it's not that, but how else can mold present itself as a problem in your body?
Well, I mean, mold is the great mimicker in many ways. It mimics a lot of other illnesses. It also is the exacerbator. What it does is mold has typical mold symptoms are upper respiratory, right? Sneezing, itchy eyes, some people have hives and dermal reactions, things like that.
We had that in one house we lived in. My husband had that. It was clear that we had mold because of that with him.
Right. So that's a typical, and that's a classic sort of, chronic sinusitis is mold related, according to the Mayo Clinic, 97% of cases, according to the Mayo Clinic. Wow. And so obviously asthma attacks and wheezing and those kinds of things. Those are primary concerns. And then you also have like toxic responses to these things where you've got a toxic load. And this is usually not caused by mold, but rather mold is usually the straw that breaks the camel's back. So there's already a toxic load, whether it be from the VOCs in our house or poor diet or genetic predisposition to difficulty detoxifying. There's lots of different reasons why people end up reaching a certain toxic threshold. And mold toxins as well, and not just the mycotoxins, which is the stuff that everyone talks about, but the musty smell, which are, some people are actually, in fact, Joan Bennett, the woman who's spearheading all that research with the fruit flies, she wants to call the microbial VOCs, which are called the musty smell, she wants to call them volatoxins instead of, because they're not really technically mycotoxins, but because they are neurotoxic and they're volatile in the sense that they're gases, and they cause neurotoxicity, she wants to call them volatoxins. So these things all accumulate, right? Okay. And so then what happens is it manifests as so many different symptoms. And it brings out autoimmune disease. It's a very common thing. So people have an autoimmune issue, and they've had the predisposition their whole life. And then this brings it to the surface.
That makes sense. Okay.
And then when the mold problem gets corrected and the rest of the body, the equilibrium is able to be achieved through other detoxification, suddenly next thing you know, that stuff simmers back down, right?
So you could have an underlying anything. So any autoimmune, I would imagine. And so maybe, or like, and then you're saying that's going to bring the symptoms up higher.
That's right.
And escalate it faster than if you were not exposed to that.
We see this all the time. I mean, and with things like arthritis, with stuff that's kind of nebulous. Again, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome,
Could it
ME, all
affect
that stuff.
like blood sugars? Could it affect like what other things could it affect?
Well, I mean, there's evidence. There's certainly evidence that mycotoxins impact your digestion.
Okay.
But that's usually from eating moldy food. And so,
Got it.
but by the way, I should mention also that everyone's worried about mycotoxins. And if you're taking mycotoxin tests, whether it be through real-time labs or Great Plains or any of these guys, and you get a big mycotoxin readings, look in your house, be very vigilant about that, but also understand that that could be a legacy thing. That could be from it could be from your office. It could be from the house that you used to live in. It could be from where you grew up. I mean, this stuff sometimes can really hang out for a long time. And a lot of the doctors don't know how to interpret this data. But the other thing is you have to look in your pantry. Mold in food is the primary source of exposure for most people. And there's really interesting data on this. There was a group of scientists that just recently went and looked and they tried to debunk some data that came out of the United Nations saying that 20% of foodstuffs or 25% of foodstuffs are mycotoxin contaminated. They came out and said, wrong, way higher. With imported grains, 60 to 80%. Imported
60
grain.
to 80%. Oh my goodness. Gosh.
So this is, it's a big deal. So that's imported grains. That's, quinoa, rice, wheat. I mean, we just learned that Ukraine's the breadbasket of the planet, right?
Yeah.
And so when they put all that wheat on a boat, or if it gets stuck because of what's going on right now, well, that stuff gets moldy, right? This is not coming over in climate controlled containers.
Sure.
Also spices, nuts, dried fruits, coffee, which, as we know from Dave Asprey and Bulletproof, right? All that stuff.
Spices and nuts, like
spices, nuts.
So how do we know? Like, this is crazy.
It is crazy. And so this is why it's very important to source your food locally as best you can. Okay. Right. This idea of buying food from international sources there's local sources for a lot of the stuff that we're buying overseas, right? You don't need to buy foreign rice. You don't need to buy foreign wheat. It's just not necessary, but we do because that's what's cheap. And that's what our big food companies are using because it's cheap.
Sure. Well, I'm also thinking like a lot of people listening to this, they're more conscious, like, and then maybe they're not eating wheat. They're not eating processed foods, but then you're saying things like your spices and your nuts. Like, you're like, wait a minute. This is, you think you're being healthy, and wow.
Yep. And it gets better, right? So check this out. Wine, applesauce, tomato sauce. Why? Because they take the ugly fruit that they're not going to sell at the store that's already moldy and they throw it in the bucket. And then that bucket sits there for a bit, right?
Because there's probably a certain amount allowed in or whatever that's considered safe.
Yep.
That's crazy. So how do you test your food? How do you know, like, how do you guarantee it doesn't have it?
We don't have the ability yet to do that. And there's a company called Allergy Amulet that's working on some cool stuff using some technology that lets you scan food for gluten and some other, and so ultimately we'll probably have the ability to scan food for the compounds that we call mycotoxins. But right now we don't have so the best advice is no sugar, no grains. That's the good advice anyway, right? Good advice anyway. But it's particularly good advice for anyone who's trying to avoid mycotoxins and mold in food. And you want to stay away from, like I said, I hate to say it because I feed my kid applesauce. He loves that. But you limit the things that lend itself to that kind of food processing.
I would have never imagined that all those things, because you would think you would see it on there. Like, oh, well, I would like cheese. You see it on there and you throw it away or you cut it. Some people cut it off. I don't. If I see mold on fruit or cheese, that's going in the trash. I don't want any part of it. By the way, is it okay to cut things off of that, or is that just as bad? Like, I've always thought if it's already on the food, you don't want the food.
Well, it depends. A soft cheese, you don't want to keep soft cheese if it's got mold running through it. If it's unless it's designed to be that way. Blue cheese, like blue cheese, Roquefort, stuff like that, right? That is mold. That is Penicillium Roquefort. It's literally we find that stuff growing on sheetrock. So I mean, that same strain will grow on your walls as well as it will grow in dairy products. So yeah, you don't want it. But fruit. You can cut off in most cases. Okay. Soft cheeses you should throw away.
You can cut off and then
cut that off. Okay. Yeah. But hard cheeses you can cut off. Soft cheeses you should toss. Yeah.
Soft, toss, hard. Okay. So back to the house thing, because again, I think this is like a huge, like I said, my husband's like, you have got wood, we have wood, it dries out, there's no issue. And now you have me thinking totally differently. What do people do? And I'm assuming this is why you developed a test. Like, how do you know without taking apart your whole house?
Well, I mean, that's it, right? So I always say you're the best mold test. First of all, you're usually the best mold test. And by the way, there's no perfect mold test. We made the best one available, but that doesn't mean it's still not a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. The same way there's no silver bullet for human testing. I compare the body to buildings all the time because the metaphor plays all the way through. There's no test that you can take for yourself. If I said to you, Natalie, I don't feel well. You're my doctor. I don't feel well. Test me. I don't feel well.
No, there's so many different angles you can go. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, well, let's do a physical. Well, that's an inspection. Right. And then based upon what you find, let's do some testing, but you don't just test. Right. And that's what people want with mold. They just want to test. And I have to remind them that they don't have that for bodies. Yeah. Why do you think they were going to have that for buildings? There's a lot more money in buildings tests, in body tests than there are in building tests. There would be one of those tests if you could do that, but there can't, there isn't. So you can't. And so we don't. So what you have to do is you have to rely first on your God-given senses. If you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something. So what does that mean? If you see any sort of discoloration that's similar, that indicates moisture intrusion. If you see discoloration that looks like colonization, right? Those small dots, and everyone's seen mold growth. So you can tell, usually a good flashlight will also tell you, you can shoot the flashlight across the mold and you can see if you go straight at it, you can't always see, but if you shoot across it. So if you see something, you're looking for any signs of moisture intrusion, any signs of fungal growth, blistering paint, trim pulling away from the walls. These are the dead giveaways, right?
Okay.
If you smell something, right? We talked about the musty odor. That's a very, very clear indicator, right? If it smells damp, musty, or some people call it musky, but it's that mold odor is a clear indication. That's where you need to start really looking for where the moisture source is coming from. And then lastly, if you feel something, and feel something is very personal. Everybody's got a different response to these things. Some people end up with headaches, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, general malaise. Some people have allergic sensitivities. Some people, again, have their autoimmune stuff flare up. Yep. But if when your building is doing something that's not right, at least you should cultivate that, right? The idea is that we do have these senses are powerful. And if you use those senses, that's your first step. Then if you've identified that there is a reason for concern, then there's a bunch of different things you can do. We actually have an ebook on our website, which allows people to do their own inspection. You can hire a professional, which will cost you, $1,000 or more to have a qualified professional come over, and they're going to do an inspection and then collect some samples. There are do-it-yourself products. We make one that allows you to test the air using the same devices the professionals use. That's not a replacement for a professional, but it's a really good first step. And then you start to develop a picture, because if you can use your senses to develop the first couple of, one data point is not actionable. I smell it. That's not actionable. Where's the moisture source? You start to assemble. I smell it. I see it. I feel something. Great. Got some samples. I got high spore counts. You start to develop a picture of what's going on. Yeah. Unfortunately, mold remediation is still something that needs to be done by professionals. So at some point, if you have that problem, depending upon whether you're renting or whether you own, that changes everything, right? Which direction you're going to go. And really, this is not about remediation, because that's a whole podcast, quite frankly. That's a whole interview, just the permutation that you can go through. Yeah. But the initial diagnostics, what we need to do is get people to start trusting themselves and, trust your intuition, trust your senses, but then get the data. Right. So that's why I say trust your senses and then test. Test, don't guess. They say that a lot in functional medicine. Same thing here. Test, don't guess.
Test, don't guess. Yep. I do want to circle back to one thing you said at the very beginning of this session. You mentioned about your mom, and you said there's a connection there. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that back around. So my experience with mold, initially, I thought, well, I was the one that got sick. But she was clearly sick. She was clearly ill in many ways. And it wasn't until 15 years later that I was, working with Dr. Joan Bennett and working with the fruit flies.
Sure.
And actually it was 2008 when this kind of came together for me, when Brown University did a study and they looked at 6,000 homes, and they had people report their general quality of life, as well as the conditions in the building. So it's self-reporting, right? But it's still a big study, 6,000, it's huge. Okay. And so what they found, a direct correlation between mold and dampness indoors and depression. And I thought, wow, I mean, geez.
Wow.
I mean, and so they couldn't connect the dots. In other words, they couldn't say, well, this mold exposure caused the depression, right? But rather what they posited was potentially that people who report a mold problem that has not been corrected yet and are reporting a low quality of life may very well feel disempowered, right? In other words, if you got a mold problem, you can't fix it. That means you're probably struggling with some things.
Yeah.
You got a landlord that won't do it, or you don't have a budget to fix it if you've got the capability to do so. There's a lot of reasons why someone would be depressed living in a moldy building. And that for a long time sat with me. And then Dr. Joan Bennett at Rutgers began doing the fruit fly experiments. And she identified that they stopped producing dopamine.
Oh my
They
gosh.
got depressed. And so that changed my whole view on this, which is that the musty smell, by the way, causes fatigue, difficulty concentrating, cognitive impairment, all sorts of stuff. Sleep disturbances, mold rage. These are well-established byproducts of chronic exposure to mold growth. My mother was living in that house. She was also an alcoholic, but the question is, was she self-medicating against that, right?
And what came first?
Which came first, right? So I firmly believe that mold problem was an underlying variable in her demise.
Wow.
And so in many ways, my mission here, is driven by my own personal experience, but not just mine. Right. I mean, I really do think that my mother's depression was directly related to the conditions in the building. And it was a combination, chemical and also the disempowerment.
Yes.
There were a lot of things that she couldn't get fixed there. She didn't have the budget. She didn't have. So it's a emotional rat's nest, but it's also a chemical reality. And so it's very important. Anyone listening to this, if you've got a musty smell and you're feeling emotionally dysregulated, take action. Take action on this.
Yeah,
this is so literally helpful. It's a matter of, it's not just your lungs. It's not just this is a holistic problem. It affects you neurologically, physically, emotionally, and otherwise.
Well, Jason, this was phenomenal. I have so many more questions. I'm going to have you on for a part 2, especially about the remediation, because now I got to go dig into my house and make sure I don't have a mold problem here. And I'm sure people listening are like, okay, wait, stop, hold the phone. I have symptoms. I have things going on. How do I check? Where do they go? Where do you want them to go so they can order your kit? Because I'm ordering one stat. I need it in my house. I need to know. And by the way, do you recommend you test your house first, test your body first? Does it matter? Like what do we do first?
Okay. So first of all, I think that the environment is the most important variable, right? You got to make sure, get your moisture under control and know what's in your air, right? I mean, we got the four basic human needs: air, water, food, shelter. Shelter's obvious. We need one of those. Food, you can live without 3 weeks. Water, you can live without for about 3 days, and then air, you can live without for about 3 minutes. And yet, of all those 4 things, we think about air the least. And so we need to bring our focus back to that, right?
Okay.
In terms of how to get in touch with me or with us, so we created a welcome page at gotmold.com. It's actually gotmold.com/Natalie Jill. And if you go there, you'll find that we put up an ebook there, a free download. It's 46 pages of inspection checklists and FAQs and really, really useful stuff for anyone who's beginning their mold journey. We get a lot of positive feedback about that. It will actually take you for a journey through your own home. You'll see things that you've never seen before.
Sounds so good. Okay. Everyone's got to go there. So we're going to go to gotmold.com/Natalie Jill, and they'll see that there.
That's
and then
right.
you even have a coupon, Natalie Jill 10.
That's right.
For people.
That's right. And so that's also posted there. And you can link right out of there to the shop page if you want to take a look at the kits. We sell 1, 2, and 3 room kits and also refills. So people who buy a kit can retest their air for less in the future. And so, yes, it's gotmold.com/Natalie Jill, and then Natalie Jill 10 in case anybody wants to just go straight to gotmold.com and take a look. And that gives you a 10% discount.
Amazing. And we're going to have to plan to do a whole nother episode on remediation. Hopefully I don't need it in my house, but we're going to have a lot more questions there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.